Today we're going to be talking about why you might want to take more than 5 grams of creatine and how to do it without rushing to the toilet and literally flushing away all of the powder that you've just put into your body. Now, creatine monohydrate is the most studied sports supplement in the world, touted for its ability to augment strength, improve fat-free mass, and recovery in resistance-trained individuals. Now, while these benefits are amazing and they're very well understood, more and more evidence emerges of its ability to improve things like cognitive function, function during sleep deprivation, and even potentially warding off neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. However, the issue that we might run into is all of those studies are starting to look at these elevated doses beyond just that 5 gram standard dose, looking at 10, 20. In the sleep deprivation studies, for someone of my size, you would be using 35 grams of creatine, and there's a big issue here. Firstly, let's briefly understand how creatine works. Creatine supplementation increases intracellular levels of creatine, which ultimately leads downstream to an increase in ATP production. And ATP production basically means that we have more energy. This is where this feeds into its ability to improve performance, but also where it feeds into that increase in energy, specifically in the brain, is going to improve its outcomes with neurodegenerative diseases and also in like sleep deprivation settings. Now, beyond just this intracellular increase in creatine is going to pull water into the cell. So when they talk about increases in fat-free mass and people looking fuller and more jacked, it's basically just because water has been pulled into the cell. Now, let's quickly review some of the literature to understand actually what's going on, what has been shown in studies in humans to happen, so that then we can move on to how much creatine do we want to take, and as I said, how do I do it without ending up flushing it all down the loo. This study here is an amalgamation of many other studies, and it was looking at creatine for exercise and sports performance with recovery considerations, and this was in healthy populations, so it's very applicable to those in the sort of athletic community. Probably the key finding here is that there was an increase in energetic output during activities involving intermittent, high-intensity, short bouts of exercise. So in that short duration, things like strength lifts, sprinting, etc., there was an increase in energetic output and therefore performance. However, it also showed promise in facilitating recovery post-exercise. So for athletes, there's clearly some benefit here. However, creatine goes much further than this. Another high-quality study is shown on the screen here, and this was the effects of creatine supplementation on cognitive function in adults. It was a systematic review of 16 randomized controlled trials involving a total of 492 participants. Across all of these participants, there was a statistical significant increase in memory. Positive effects on memory. There's many other things here, but ultimately what this study took was loads of other studies, and it found that across a broad range of ages, as you can see 20 to 76 years old, there was an increase in memory from creatine. Now, digging further into this and its effects on cognition, we can look at sleep deprivation. This study here looked at single-dose creatine and its improvements on cognitive performance in sleep-deprived settings. And what was shown is that there were massive increases in their ability to function cognitively. And while this is only one study, the key thing we can take away from this here is perhaps the dosing and how different it is from what we've seen in many of the other studies so far. Now, I've made a full video on how to ameliorate the effects of sleep deprivation, but what we're going to look at here is that the outcomes of administering a single high dose of creatine can partially reverse the issues in ATP production in the brain and therefore downstream brain fog, cognitive function throughout the day. The key things to take away from this is that they use 0.35 grams per kilogram of creatine. Now, obviously, simple maths, as an 100 kilo dude, I would be taking 35 grams. For my actual body weight, it's 32 grams of creatine. That is a lot of creatine. Another study that showed the use of a lot of creatine is a new study on Alzheimer's disease. This study here is a pilot study on its feasibility for the application and the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And what they found that is in all people, the feasibility of using 20 grams per day. So this is in elderly populations where their body weights are quite low. It was pretty well tolerated, and it did show some feasible benefits in Alzheimer's disease because there were increases in the methods that they used to test for memory. Now that we've got that all understood, what we need to understand is why can we not just slam, 30 grams of creatine with no deleterious effects? Well, the main issue is kind of shown here. This is a standard glass of water, and this is only 10 grams of creatine, and I have stirred it. A lot of that has not dissolved, and you may say, okay, just stir it and drink it. That you can do, and some people are not going to suffer any issues whatsoever. However, many people will get gastric distress, and as I said, have to run to the toilet and literally flush all of that creatine down the loo. Why does that happen? Well, it's explained by basic GCSE biology. Okay, so osmosis is the movement of water from a dilute to concentrated solution across a semi-permeable membrane. Now, your gut lining is a semi-permeable membrane. It needs to allow water, nutrients, etc. to move across the membrane and be absorbed into the blood. Now, the blood also, as many people will know, we are mostly made up of water, meaning that a lot of the content from the blood and surrounding the gut is going to be water. If we slam a solution of creatine that is very concentrated, the issues that we are going to have is that we now have a concentrated solution on the interior of our gut, and we have a very dilute solution relative to the creatine outside of the gut. Now, what is the result of this is the movement of said water from dilute to concentrated, meaning that that water is going to move into your gut. When the water moves into your gut, you're going to get the runs and you're going to get a sudden urge to go to the toilet. Now, if that does end up being the case, you're going to do what you need to do, wipe, flush, and unfortunately, a lot of this is probably going to be in the toilet along with some of the other stuff that you ate and hadn't yet had the chance to absorb, and that's not ideal. So how can we get around that? Well, there's many ways to get around it. The main issue here is solubility, the ability to dissolve a lot of water in here. There's a couple of more boring options. I mean, one of them is to just multi-dose the creatine. Do you need to have 20, 30 grams at once? In certain settings, like for cognitive function, probably not. You know, could you have 5 grams with breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Absolutely. However, that's not always going to be a good solution. So another option could be a shed load of water. But in order to dissolve, 10, 20, 30 grams of water, I might have to consume 3 or 4 liters of water. So actually the best way to do it, that is kind of grim, is drinking it with hot water. So thank you here to my friend Perplexity for helping me plot out the temperature versus solubilities of creatine at different temperatures. So what we've got here is we've got 4 degrees, which is pretty cold water, right? That's much colder than even an ice bath would be. No one's drinking water that cold. 20 degrees, which is basically what it's going to come out of your tap at. 50 degrees, which is warm, but you can probably still drink it fine. And then 60 degrees, which is hot. I sort of assumed a 20 gram dose here. If you're consuming that at room temperature and you want all of it to fully dissolve, you would need 1.42 liters of water. That is a lot of water, versus if you consume it using 50-degree water, you would only need 0.6 of a liter. So what you can see is probably the best hack to take this without any gastric distress is increasing the temperature a little bit. Now, my final thoughts on this are just, even though that data is quite helpful, you might not need to use that much water. So again, looking at that, this says for 20 grams, you need 0.58 liters. That means that for 10 grams, you only need about 300 milliliters of water. I have very commonly, at room temperature, consumed 10 grams of creatine in maybe 500 to 600 mils of water. It is not fully soluble at that volume, at that temperature. However, I have had no gastric distress from this. So what I'm saying is you do not need to heat your water, but if you want to experiment with much higher doses of creatine, because as I've said, it has many different benefits, and you're getting gastric distress, one of the ways to get around this is considering multiple doses, larger volumes of water, which I wouldn't recommend really, or increase the temperature of your water to improve solubility. And I forgot to say this at the end, but if any of that helped you, please consider dropping a like, maybe subscribing, and letting me know anything that you'd like me to discuss in future. Have a lovely day.